This is a Film Stories original podcast.
You're going to learn of things, folks. You're going to hear the words, and they'll come to make sense to you.
Hello and welcome back everyone to the Xcast. The truth is in here. I am Tony Black, your host, well, your co-host these days, because I have a whole troupe around me who've been helping me wrap up the second season, and we have reached the end, or sort of the end, because it's the season 2 finale we're talking about today, the 25th episode of the second season, the legendary Anasazi. And I am really chuffed to have back, in a certain sense, I think of, symmetry for the entire season, my mythology buddy for season 2, Darren Mooney.
Just call me the mythology man. Or don't call me the mythology man. Whichever works, it's all good.
Can we call you Mr. M? Like Mr. X or something? Or have you seen Arrested Development?
No, I haven't. Okay,
well, you won't get the Mr. F joke then. But so anyone who's seen Arrested Development will get that. But there you go. It's good to have you back, Mr. M.
Oh, thank you very much. My pleasure to be back, as ever. And for this as well, which, to be honest, is great. I feel like we're not spoiling too much if we acknowledge that it's great.
We need to say that off the top. Yeah, I said as much on Facebook today. It's brilliant. It's Anasazi. Everybody loves Anasazi. It is awesome. And I think we both commented that we've got like some serious notes about this episode. Because it's as I described it, it's a beautiful beast, Darren, this one.
It really is. It's something you can sort of jump into and chew, and it's got... I think actually... To be honest, because I think when I was talking to you about Colony and Endgame, I was saying how, like, the end of the second season is the writers figuring out what they want to do with going into the third season. And Anasazi is almost perfectly formed as, like, here's a mission statement for what you're getting next year. And it's like, here's a bunch of stuff we're going to talk about, and it's just going to touch on it, but it's going to touch on so much of it that it's all there. It's astounding. It's a wonderful piece of work.
It really is. So let's talk about it. Let's begin the discussion about Anasazi. Anasazi, as I say, is the 25th episode of the second season of The X-Files. It first aired on May the 19th, 1995. It had a story by Chris Carter and David Duchovny, and the teleplay was written by Chris Carter, and it was directed by R.W. Goodwin. The story sees a computer hacker known as The Thinker approaching Mulder with the MJ files, the secret behind the government cover-up of extraterrestrial life, which leads Mulder into a catastrophic situation involving the smoking man, his father, and a mysterious secret buried under the desert of New Mexico.
Mulder, Skinner's looking for you.
Come in and lock the door.
Why? What's going on?
Are you familiar with the 10 Commandments, Scully?
You want me to recite them?
Just number 4, the one about obeying the Sabbath, the part where God made heaven and earth but didn't bother to tell anybody about his side projects.
What are you talking about?
The biggest lie of all.
What is this?
The Holy Grail. The original Defense Department files. Hard evidence that the government has known about the existence of extraterrestrials for almost 50 years.
Where did you get this?
Your friendly neighborhood anarchist. I don't believe this. This is just gibberish. Damn it! I'm so sick of this crap! BS and double talk. I can't believe this.
Mulder, this may not be gibberish.
It's a joke, Scully. It's a bad joke.
I think it's just encrypted, and I think I recognize it. It looks like Navajo. It was used during World War II. My father told me that it was the only code the Japanese couldn't break. I remember the long strings of consonants.
Well, can you find out?
Well, only a handful of people can decipher it.
We'll find one of them.
Out of 10 then, Darren. I don't even know why I'm bothering to ask you this, because I think I know the answer. What would you give this?
This is a 9. So catch you off guard. You have to earn
Well
it.
done.
Yeah.
Very good, very good.
Just in the most underwhelming way possible of surprising somebody. No, it's a 9, if only because it doesn't have that sort of je ne sais quoi that sort of really elevates the, like, what I would consider to be like my top 10 X-Files episodes. I feel like if I give to 10 to Anasazi, I feel like then I have to give a 10 to, I don't know, to like Dwayne Barry, and I didn't do that. I feel kind of guilty about that now. I feel like as it stands, if I have like a very set and very sort of rigid requirement of episodes that get 10, and I can probably list them off the top of my head, then I feel like they've earned it. This is a 9. This is a high 9. This is a very high 9.
I'm going to give it a 9.5, right, based on your logic, because I gave the Erlenmeyer Flask a 10, and I love the Erlenmeyer Flask to death. So I can't give it the same as the Erlenmeyer Flask, because I don't love it quite as much as that. So by that logic, and I agree with you, I'm going to give it a 9.5. So why would you give it a 9 then?
Just it's brilliant. It's when people talk about the mythology in terms of, and it's great because we've talked about it because I've been on for most of the mythology episodes of the second season, so we want to see it grow and develop, and sort of the writers figure out what they want to do with the mythology. Because in the first season, there wasn't really a mythology. There were like episodes like Fallen Angel or EBE, but there was never a sense of like an overarching narrative. And then sort of in the second season, you get to see that sort of take shape. So you get the Dwayne Barry and Ascension stuff. You get Scully being kidnapped and returned in one breath. You get sort of Colony and Endgame, which hint at this idea of like a war in heaven and stuff like that. And then sort of Anasazi arrives. And Anasazi just purely distills. It's like all the stuff that we've been talking about for the past 2 years. And there's a lot of stuff here that comes from, say, standalone episodes that Carter's interested in, themes about, like, memory and themes about the Second World War and themes about, like, the Holocaust, for example. And what he does is he basically says, well, look, these are the themes that I consider core and essentially X-Files. I'm going to filter them down, basically, through this story, through this season finale, which in many ways, which I really like about this, is the sense that there's a really apocalyptic vibe to it. When you're watching it, it feels like the end of the world. It feels like the walls are closing in on Mulder and Scully. It feels like the narrative is just on the verge of unspooling, like that it's spinning so fast that things are just going to get out of control. So you got Mulder being paranoid. You got stuff like, you got the cigarette smoking man sort of starting to screw up. You got sort of this connection between the cigarette smoking man and Bill Mulder, which is all set up perfectly, but which still feels like everything's sort of closing in. You have like all these assumptions and all these underlying sort of things that you took for granted about the X-Files sort of being thrown up into the air, and everything's for grabs. And what's beautiful about it is that while it does this, it does it in a way that means that it can hit the ground running in the third season. Now, arguably, it doesn't, but that's a discussion for another time. But it sets it up so, like, the mythology episodes in the third season are, I would argue, some of the best, taken as a whole, the best mythology episodes in the run of the show. If only because they have, like, a singular sense of purpose. And it happens again in the 8th season where you have that singular sense of purpose. But I think that what Anasazi does is it takes everything that's been done to this point and creates a nice, like, run-in ramp, basically, like a filter through which it can distill, like, what it deems to be the essence of the X-Files at this moment in time, which is, like, it's a little bit of Eve, it's a little bit of Aubrey, it's a little bit of EBE, it's a little bit of Dwayne Barry, it's a tiny bit of Colony and Endgame so far, and it just goes, okay, well, look, this is what the mythology is, and it's just go for it, just mainline it. And just go a mile a minute. Don't stop to take a breath, because you're going to have Mulder go insane. You're going to go to New Mexico. You're going to have Scully shoot Mulder. You're going to have Mulder burned alive. You're going to have the cigarette smoking man like light up and burn a carriage full of what appear to be alien bodies, but aren't actually alien bodies. And it just comes so fast and so thick, and it's just it's fantastic. Just watching it, even now, knowing where the mythology goes and knowing how, in fairness, most of the pieces in here fit together, to be quite honest. You get a sense of just momentum and a sense of thrill and a sense that even though it's moving fast, it knows where it's going, which, to be honest, sometimes I think as the mythology went on, it moved very fast, but it didn't necessarily know where it was going. With this, Carter basically has a list of stuff, and it's like, next year, I'm going to do this. And it's like, okay, but I'm going to give you a taste now.
Well, you only have to look at, like, for instance, the boxcar, in the desert. Very clearly it's got Sierra Railroad on it. And obviously later on, in Season 3, we've got Nissan 731, in which we have one of these boxcars, working on a train track, and it's little. He obviously had those stories in mind as he went on. It's funny you should talk about the mile a minute and the sheer amount in it. Darren Morgan called it the kitchen sink episode to Chris Carter because he said there's so much in it. Like he had no idea how we could possibly pull it all off, but obviously he does in a way that I think he's really, and maybe this is partly the fact that David Duchovny's got a hand in the story as well, but it makes you wonder because it's. I mean, I'm a fan of Chris Carter, and I know you're a fan of Chris Carter as well, but he doesn't always write scripts that have this level of clarity in them and have this level of not just idea but also plot and movement and script and story. And as I was watching it, I was thinking, well, even though Anasazi ends on a whopping cliffhanger and, like you said, sets up season 3 and beyond, it almost also feels like its own told story in a way as well, which is a real testament to the episode. And it's not often that Carter was able to distill it, as you said, in that way. And it's even now it's a surprise in that perspective as well.
Yeah, no, I think when you mentioned Duchovny, Duchovny is massively underrated as an X-Files writer. I think in part because, and we talked about this when we were talking about Colony and Endgame, which are heavily influenced by his own writing, where he was one paper away from having a master's in English, if I recall correctly. He knows the structure of stories. There's interviews where they discuss going to his trailer, and on his bookshelf he has Joseph Campbell. Duchovny is a writer who is very interested in structure and who understands these mythic beats. I think you got some of that in Colony and Endgame. It's no coincidence that they're the episodes that introduce Mulder's father, which is sort of the important part of that Campbellian myth. And I don't think it's a coincidence that Duchovny returns as sort of story guy for the episode in which Mulder's father meets his end, and which Mulder's father has this beautiful moment where stuff that was implied, and again, the wonderful thing about Anasazi is not only does it set up what's coming, it also makes sense of what's already happened. So all of a sudden the conversations between Mulder and his father in Colony and Endgame about Samantha, about sort of you let her go, you had her and you let her go, this is going to kill your mother, and this sort of shared sense of grief. You get a sense that suddenly makes sense in terms of Mulder and his father talking about it, because his father's well, look, you're going to hear things about me that are going to change the way that you think about me. And you're that is the most Freudian, most Campbellian, it's the most archetypal mythic story. It's Star Wars, it's Luke discovering that his father isn't the man he thought he was, isn't the hero of the Clone Wars. He's actually this monster who's done this horrible thing and sort of caused all the horrible stuff that happened in his life. I think that you can see, I would be very surprised to discover that was not a Duchovny beat, that Duchovny was not in the room going, well, look, I want, Chris, your themes are about authority and power, and I basically want to tie that back to something as simple as his dad. I'd be very surprised if that was not Duchovny's big contribution to the script.
It would make sense. I think it would make sense because I think Chris Carter was looking at it from a different standpoint in terms of some of the elements of the story. He was originally inspired by the episode when he became fascinated by the Anasazi, the tribe that obviously formed the title of the episode and become quite a key point in terms of the story in to an extent, or certainly the mythology behind the story later. And he also went on vacation to a place called Sedona in Arizona, which is where they did some second unit shooting later on in order to create the quarry and the New Mexico surroundings, really. So he was interested in that, and apparently, according to Carter, Duchovny was key in the idea of leaving the cliffhanger that suggests Mulder's dead. He really wanted to come up with the idea that one of the two, whether it's him or Scully, whether it's Mulder or Scully, actually are apparently dead by the end of the episode. And I think possibly because, given how the X-Files had already at this point become renowned for killing people off after Deep Throat, I think maybe he wanted to play with the idea that people will go, wow, have they actually just killed Mulder? And people may be even prepared to believe that the X-Files would go that far.
Well, I think there's also even the sense of transcendence, the sense that and this is something when you talk about that happens later in the run, but it's also happened already with Scully. The X-Files is very fond of the trope of characters going to death's door, having that spiritual experience and coming back to the point where it's almost like a rite of passage. So Scully obviously had that in one breath. Mulder gets it coming out of Anasazi. Later on in the third season, it happens to Skinner. There's a sense that Doggett isn't properly working the X-Files until he dies and comes back from the dead. I think that, and I think I get the sense that I can understand why Duchovny would want that, because Duchovny, it has that sort of mythical quality to it. It has that sort of like quality of like crossing the unknown barrier, the undiscovered country, to quote Hamlet. It's the ultimate sort of experience, or the ultimate sort of transcension almost for the, or transcending for the actors and for the characters. Like I think there's a lot to that.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's definitely something that he wanted to tap into. And I think the episode as a whole, I think, is concerned with elevating. Oh, you mentioned this earlier. It's concerned with really pushing the button on a lot of huge stuff. For me, this is one of two key points in terms of the actual ongoing story and mythology of the show. Really, I think it's this and Fight the Future, which are the two key points where I think that's where you learn the most, and Mulder and Scully kind of learn the most as well as characters. This three-parter, this obviously begins, because obviously this story continues in The Blessing Way and Paperclip at the start of season 3. But it always, when I was growing up, and even now, as a huge X-Files fan looking back, it feels like the biggest story sometimes. This feels like the story that really propelled the show out of being this weird, quirky little odd niche interest into being the kind of phenomenon that now we see with Game of Thrones, or we saw with Lost, or that kind of thing. These huge, powerful, shows with so much going on. I think the Anasazi is the one that fires that bullet, really.
Well, I mean, yeah, two things. Like, first of all, like, if I remember correctly, and I might be wrong here, in terms of UK broadcasters, I believe this was the point at which it switched from BBC to Sky One. So this was the point at which it became like a hot import, as opposed to just a nerdy fringe property. And second of all, like, you can see its influence in terms of how many times over the course of the show do they do that format, which is cliffhanger season finale, 2-part season premiere. And they do it later on. They do it in the 4th season and 5th season. They do it from the 6th season to the 7th season. They arguably do it from the 7th season to the 8th season as well, depending on how sort of loosely you regard a 3-parter to be. And, like, you can tell that, like, this is something that worked, and this is something that's amazing. I think you mentioned, actually, when we were talking about, I can't remember if it was, we were talking about Endgame and Colony, or Ascension and Dwayne Barry, but it was, you talked about, like, when they released the VHS of this in the UK, and they released it before it had aired on television, or before the two season 3 episodes had aired on television. So it became this sort of really hot thing, which was remarkable for a show that, would have been regarded as fringe a year earlier. Like, when it comes to TV shows on VHS, it was this and Star Trek, which is remarkable.
Yeah, this was the unopened file. I think that was what I was talking about before. Yeah, in one of the mythology ones we did before, the unopened file was, and that's the thing. It wasn't even called Anasazi. It wasn't even called Blessing Way, or it was something like, it had a completely different name, the VHS. It was file whatever, the unopened file. And it was a huge deal having these 3 episodes, put out there. Obviously now, in the days of, not just DVDs or Blu-ray box sets, but with streaming services and things, it seems like a completely alien, strange world to have 3 episodes released on a VHS. But that was it. That was how it was done back then when we were growing up. And it really stands out as being these are the episodes I think you could show somebody who doesn't really know what the show's about and wants to actually... if somebody says, why is the X-Files so great? I would point them towards this 3-parter and say, this is what it's about, really. This is what it was doing when it was towards the top of its game. So watch that. Well, actually, maybe cut the Blessing Way out of that. but watch Anasazi and Paperclip.
Well, watch Anasazi. I'll fill you in on what happens in Blessing Way. Then sit down and watch Paperclip.
Yeah.
Or you could just watch Clyde Bruckman's Final Recode.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
You might, whoever you're talking about the Blessing Way with will probably have things to say about that. But Anasazi itself and Paperclip coming out the other end are just fantastic. Like, they really are. Like, they're pure mythology. And they're like, it's like mythology... when mythology was like cocaine and heroin mixed together, when it was like, this was what you tuned in to watch and this was event television. And I mean, you mentioned the Game of Thrones comparison earlier, which I think is actually quite accurate, because we don't have that anymore. We don't really have event television as a result of the stuff that you mentioned, as a result of DVD, as a result of streaming, as a result of there being 999 channels on and there being nothing to watch and there being peak TV. Like, it's hard to get a sense of how big a show could have been at the point where there were only 3 networks and Fox on television. and therefore, like, your audience share was going to be, it was possible to be a water cooler show, to be a show that everybody was watching, and not just everybody in your office. It was like people you met at the coffee shop. The person working at the coffee shop was also watching it. And like, you get the sense that like now you don't really have that due to the fact that most of the good shows are on HBO and not everybody has HBO, for example, or due to like peak television or the diffusion of television channels. Like, this was an event, and this was an event in a way that very few television shows now can be.
Yeah, I think Game of Thrones is one of those rare examples of something that even now, with all of this all of these channels and all of this stuff, when that comes back, and as we record, it will be in a month, that is going to be an enormous event, and you will get millions and millions of people sit down and watch that as it airs, because they won't want to be...
And talk about it the next day.
They'll talk about it the next day, and they'll be furiously online about it. They won't want to be spoiled. People will, it will be a huge, huge thing. And again, it will be when the final episode's in, whether it's 2018 or 2019. And it was the same with Lost. Lost had exactly the same effect. Whenever a new season of Lost would start, and especially when it was the final ever episode. I mean, I remember the final ever episode of Lost, I stayed up till 5 a.m. so I could live watch it with the US. And I actually did it. Yeah, I watched it live because I didn't want to be spoiled on the end, and it just destroyed me because I was so invested in that show that I was obsessed with it for a while. And it was exactly the same feeling that I had with the X-Files. I do have with Game of Thrones to an extent as well now, but it was the closest I'd ever come to that feeling of the X-Files when it was at its peak, which is exactly how people felt. And these episodes, as I say, I think were at the point when that feeling really, really started to kick off. So IMDb because we've been doing the IMDb ratings all season, so we'll finish with this. IMDb gives Anasazi, I'd say appropriately, the highest rating of the entire season. It gets 9.3 overall out of 10 from 2,829 votes. As we say every week, IMDb is an aggregator, so it can't be taken as gospel, but that is the highest rated episode of the second season. Just under it being Endgame and Colony, which got a 9, and then you've got things like One Breath, Ascension, Dwayne Barry just trailing underneath that. So I think really it's, and we'll get on to doing a little bit of a general chat about season 2 later, but I think really Anasazi is held in such a high regard by so many people even now, and I think justified, in a justified way, really.
Yeah, no, I mean, you mentioned that earlier when you were saying, like, if you could sit down and get people to watch one mythology episode, it would be this one. Like, this has, like, so much of what would be fleshed out and developed and explored. It sets out so much sort of ground to cover for the mythology that's still to come, in a way that it hits on most of the big stuff. So you've got drugged water, you've got stuff like, you've got dead bodies, you've got buried train cars, you've got aliens that might actually be humans who've been subject to experimentation, you've got vaccination gone wrong, you've got hacking, you've got international, like, you've got that wonderful opening scene of all the international conspirators going around and going, not my problem. You've got like this wonderful sort of body of like conspiracy and even just X-Files mythology stuff to draw on. Like, it's like, you said the kitchen sink episode, it's like the grab bag of X-Files mythology. Like, it has almost everything you could want from an X-Files mythology episode.
It is. It's like
I'm trying to think what it's missing.
Well, it's hard. It is genuinely hard to say. It really is. I think it's.
Yeah, it's even got shirtless Mulder.
Well, almost pantless Mulder. Actually, at one, he's just in his briefs. Apparently, according to the if you listen to the episode commentary with Bob Goodwin, that was the second take where you see him in his pants and he's just lying there. Apparently, the first take he had the covers over him, and the idea was he was going to reveal under the covers and get out the bed. Turns out David Duchovny wore something like jokey and stupid. So when he pulled out the covers, he was wearing like something with a silly face on it or whatever. And then they just said, "Yeah, we won't do that."
Yeah. No more surprises.
Yeah. So it is the kitchen sink. So there's lots to chew over with Anasazi. So let's get into it. Let's talk in depth about Anasazi. The teaser then, which is dated April the 9th, and this episode is very key in dating all of the episode. It takes place pretty much over the course of a whole week, which is something that's quite rare in the X-Files. You don't normally get the date every scene, but this begins on April the 9th with the Indian tribesmen in the Mexico desert. Not tribesmen in the sense of, isolated or anything. These are, normal guys living normal lives.
The first pan down that you see is to a white picket fence. which does a wonderful job of establishing, yep, these are just people, like, it's not like you're going to get people speaking in these horrible stereotypes or, sort of all this sort of New Age mysticism, which might be lurking around the corner maybe, but we'll talk about that at some point in the future.
Yeah.
But there's this wonderful shot of, like, this is just people who are living in New Mexico who happen to be Native American. So you have the white picket fence, you have the motorbike and stuff like that. And you even have the bit where, like, when Albert Holstein says something like, don't play with snakes today, or the earth has a secret that it needs to tell. You have his grandson sort of looking at him going, oh, okay, yeah. Grandpa's on it again.
Well, this is it. Albert Hosteen is an interesting character, played by Floyd Red Crow Westerman, who he's sort of, in some respects, I suppose, he kind of represents what you would expect from a very sort of clued-in Native American, spiritual man. He's very calm. He's almost got a gift of prophecy in some respects, or it seems like that. He's very, he is sort of a kind of, and this becomes clearer as the episode goes on. He's a bit like a gatekeeper in a way for truth, for pure truth, and he's a kind of a very pure soul character. And it's interesting, like you say. There's that element of different ages and different evolution for their people, and the grandson with his motorbike and his leathers and things like that. It almost has that feeling like if you could suggest that the Earth is like he suggests, he's repelling this secret, wants this secret to be known. It's that idea that maybe some of the old ways are being lost or are disappearing, and Albert is one of those examples of somebody with this immense amount of knowledge and these secrets, who is the one that he's the sage, isn't he? He's the one that Mulder ends up. He could tell him everything, in theory. And that's what makes him a really interesting character.
If Mulder would take the time and actually not go into the train car, he could just pull over by the side of the road, get a coffee with Albert Holstein, it would all be perfectly fine. much less eventful episode, mind you.
Yeah, but one of the things he'd learn. He'd learn a lot.
I do like the idea that the second season finale is building momentum until Mulder and Albert get together and have a 20-minute conversation in which Albert explains in great depth. In fact, I'm actually quite glad that Albert wasn't around for the final episode of the show, because it just turned into a big sort of exposition drive. Because I can imagine some original cut of that where it's 90 minutes of Albert Hosteen sitting down with a cigarette and a coffee going, let me tell you about this, Mr. Mulder. You mentioned that there with the grandson, because the script to this is, and it's not something you generally say about Carter scripts, and I think in fairness you could argue this is the influence of Duchovny. There's a very clear there's a tightness to it, in the sense that in that scene between Albert and his grandson, you get that immediate sense of, and you mentioned it there, the sense that the old ways have been lost, but also the sense that children and grandchildren having less respect for their elders. There's the point where when he mentions that about don't play with any snakes or whatever, his grandson sort of rolls his eyes. And you get that then, that obviously later on then comes back into play when you get to Mulder and talking about his father, and Bill Mulder talking about how you're going to hear things that are going to basically affect the way that you think of me. And this sort of idea that throughout, and it's something that, to be fair, Carter returns to time and time again in terms of the X-Files, but this idea that the current generation have inherited the world from their parents. I think what Anasazi does very, very well is that it captures that sense that runs through the X-Files, that maybe the world that we inherited from our parents isn't the world that we thought we were going to get. And
that's a fascinating idea, really, and it's something that through character, it's funny, there is a certain element of fatherhood that runs throughout this entire episode, and if you think of it in terms of Albert, and you could look at Deep Throat as well in a similar way, in terms of these fatherly, grandmaster figures who have this arcane knowledge that they don't end up passing down for various different reasons, whether it's that they're dead, whether it's that they're feeling, they have to keep these secrets out of guilt or out of, shame or whatever, or then it's someone like Albert who keeps them maybe because. And my sense with Albert, and as you get this especially towards the end of Paperclip, is that Albert keeps them because it's not his role to tell everybody everything. It's part of that whole idea. He says it later to Mulder, doesn't he? He says, why are you here? Why are you helping me? Mulder says, and he says, well, you're open to the truth, aren't you? It's that he knows Mulder is open to finding it himself. Albert will push him along the way and point him along the way, but he won't sit down with him with that coffee and go, well, there was this alien black oil called Purity, which blah, 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 blah.
It is, and I mean, there's even the sense that in that opening scene with Albert, you get it, where it's not like we have a secret to reveal. It's like the Earth has a secret that it needs to tell. And I think, because we kind of, when we were talking about, like, we talked about this in Endgame, I think, where we were asking, like, what is Mulder's end game when he discovers the truth? Like, what does Mulder plan to do with the truth? And how, I think the X-Files sort of argues that, like, Mulder getting the truth and what he does with it is irrelevant. It's more how Mulder discovers it. It's more Mulder opening himself up to the possibility of discovering it. And so the idea is that, like, Albert suggests that the world has these secrets that it wants to tell you if you are willing to listen to them. And that sounds horribly new agey and mystical, and trust me, it's going to get even more explicit as this story continues. But it's very true in a sense of, like, a philosophy of looking at the world, the way the X-Files looks at the world, which is, like, you have to ask questions. Like, if people just tell you how the world is, that's not learning, and that's not of value, and that's not going to make the world a better place. If you ask those questions yourself, if you are open to discovering the possibilities that are out there, the truth that is out there, so to speak, then you are enriched by it, and the world is enriched by the fact that you are willing to learn, that you're open to it. I think that Anasazi covers that very, very well, actually. I think that you're right, actually. Him sitting down with a coffee would be the worst possible... well, first of all, it would be very boring to watch. And second of all, it would sort of undermine that a bit, in that, like, the point is almost Mulder's journey as much as the destination. As infuriating as that might become as the mythology grinds on.
But that's something that I think is where, quite a lot of people draw a line in the sand in terms of fandom with certain things. And and I use Lost again as another example. It was very much in some respects, in terms of mythology, it was a similar show in that the point of that show was never about the answers. It was about the journey these characters go on along the way. The fact that they might get the occasional answer or there might be a mystery involved was part of the journey. With the X-Files, it's a different sort of mythology, but it's the same idea. The X-Files will not end with Mulder getting the truth, putting it out there, and the world being a happier place. That is not what the show is. And if season 11 is the last one, which we'll find out within the next year, which there's rumours and suggestions and hints that it might be, then that's not how it's going to end, folks. And that's not how it should end either, because that would be against the very idea of what the show is. And Anasazi, as you say, gets to the core of that really well.
Like, you have to dig it up, you have to unearth it. And while the Earth might open up in an earthquake, which I like, it's a really nice mystical touch, in that, like, Carter is very big into his mysticism, and sometimes that mysticism is too much, as might happen later in this story. I feel like I'm saying that a lot in this podcast. A lot of the stuff I like about Anasazi, I might like a lot less when it's handled more clumsily at some later point. But, like, the idea that the Earth literally opens up and bears this secret, like, through an earthquake that happens in the morning, which is just, like, it's like nature is rejecting. I think you mentioned this at the start. It's like nature is rejecting this sin that man has tried to bury. But it is this sort of sense that, like, that's it. Like, the Earth is opening up, and you need to be able to open yourself to that. And it is a little spiritual, and I like, to be honest, I know that the spirituality of the X-Files gets a lot of criticism, and some of it's justified, and I would criticize certain aspects of it. But I do like that aspect, that sort of philosophy of it, which is, like, just this idea of the world is a place that you have to make sense of in your own terms, that you have to discover truth. You can't have truth told to you.
I like it too, because mainly it's not a specific religious idea. It's not tapping into a specific worldview or a specific religion. It's very much a primal sort of sense of belief, which is what the X-Files has and what Mulder has. Scully believes in God, Mulder believes in aliens. It's that, it's the whole thing that has been drawn. But the point is that Mulder believes more in the idea of the truth, and that is essentially what Albert is talking about. It's about whether or not, if you're, like you say, if you're open, you'll find it. That's why when this teaser ends with seeing what looks like an alien skeleton that the grandson has found in the boxcar, you get a little bit of a sort of a misstep, don't you? Because Albert says they will be coming, and you're immediately at this point thinking aliens. But that's not what he means.
One of the things that we sort of talked about, and we talked about it when we were talking about the earlier second season mythology episodes, is that, like, Scully, there's a point at which the X-Files where Scully starts to look completely crazy because she refuses to believe in aliens. But one of the things that I actually quite like about Anasazi, and this is probably something that we'll talk about later, is the wonderful twist where everything that looks alien and that looks inhuman and that looks different and monstrous and something that we can't categorize within our frame of reference In this case, a lot of it turns out to be man. Like, a lot of it turns out to be stuff that we are unable to fathom, but which is tied to horrible, horrible things that have been done in our name by the generation before us, who thought that they were protecting the world for us, who thought they were doing things to make the world safer for us. And then you see that the result of this is this thing that looks completely alien to us, that we can't understand, that's beyond our frame of reference. And I really, really like that. Also, it's a great teaser image to close on.
Yeah, it's a real ooh moment when you see that thing. And then you get one of the rare examples of when the title card changes at the end of the teaser, at the end of the credits. And it's I'm going to horrendously mispronounce this, but here we go. El Anigo Ahute, I think is how you say it, which means the truth is out there in Navajo. Which is what that means, which is quite fitting, really, in terms of what the episode is talking about and the kind of people in the episode and stories and things like that. And so once we're out of the teaser, it's the next day, so we're on to April 10th, and we meet the Thinker, finally. And I think the Thinker gets mentioned in one breath, if I remember rightly, Darren, which you were on, of course, one of our most popular episodes. And he's sitting here reading 30 Greatest Conspiracies, as you would be, as a...
He's not just reading it. The implication is he's correcting it. Yeah. He's sitting there with a pen making notes in the margin, which is, by the way, it's a great introduction to a character like that.
Yeah, it sets up the kind of guy he is, isn't he? Kenneth Sooner, as we soon find out when the lone gunmen go to Mulder. What I like about the Thinker, and it taps into what we were talking about earlier in terms of Mulder and what he would get out of the truth at the end. The Thinker seems to have a very pure... I mean, it gets him killed in the end, but he seems to have a very pure idea of what he wants out of this. You know, when he downloads the MJ files, having no idea that he was going to do it, like, oh my god,
yeah. He's an anarchist in a chaotic system, which I like as well. Which is like, he's an anarchist that anarchy happens to.
Yeah. And he's completely taken aback when this like, you know, gold mine lands in his lap, and he just takes it to Mulder and says, "I want you." What is it he says? He says, I want you to make sure those rat bastards pay, you know, and answer to the people. And then he just saunters off, well, to his death, ultimately. But it's that, you know, he was always going to die, because he seems to be a character of virtue. And that's...
never a good thing on this show.
He's good because everyone... He was almost like the Lost Beetle, wasn't he? He was the fourth lone gunman. But he never... Obviously, he doesn't get a scene with the lone gunman, ultimately. But... I suppose his character serves a purpose, doesn't he? You know, you could have done more with the Thinker, but I think he serves the purpose in obviously passing on this, you know, this knowledge to Mulder.
Well, again, you get that sense of the knowledge being out there if you're willing to look for it. And the point is, he didn't even know what he was looking for, so to speak, and he still managed to stumble across it as well. I think, actually, the Thinker is a name for one of the posters on the Internet message board, if I remember correctly. Isn't it one of the X-Files message boards? Except I think it refers to a guy known as The Thinker.
Oh, okay. Okay.
And then they brutally murdered him.
Standard, yeah. But obviously, when he downloads the MJ files, this is where you get the first instance that the X-Files is much bigger than we think it is in terms of the mythology, in terms of the conspiracy, because we're at the UN, for goodness sake, and we've got... you know, a selection of brief government types, Spanish, Japanese, German, all of whom know what the MJ files are, know that this is a really bad thing, that they've been breached, and ultimately they get on the phone to the smoking man and go, sort this out, mate. And that's a huge moment, though, isn't it, in terms of the mythology, seeing all these people in power around the world. And
in terms of scale as well. Like, I mean, it sets up, again, this is setting up something that they'll come back to in the third season, because, I mean, in the third season you have the Japanese in, say, Nicey and 731, but you also have the trip to Hong Kong in, like, Viper Maru and Apocria. And obviously then later on you go to Russia, you've got all this sort of stuff as well. One of the things I found very interesting about this, and it's something that's established very cleverly and very effectively very early. The people who are on the phone call, there's an Italian, not Spanish, my mistake, yeah. And a German. And they're calling the cigarette smoking man. When was the last time that the Italians, the Germans, and the Japanese were on the same side? Not exactly, like, it is a relatively subtle touch, until you sort of think about it and you go, wait a minute.
Hang on.
But, yeah. We're sort of one step away from the cigarette smoking man wearing a swastika. But I also love that their first reaction is, this is not my problem. This is somebody else's. Deal with this. Yeah, it didn't. I think one of them says, you know, did it happen, you know, has it happened to us? And no, it's the Americans. And I think it's the German guy who says, well, this is their problem. Yeah, they need to sort it out. It's not, you know, we're not taking the blame for this.
This is there. And then Smoking Man's great line when he goes, "Gentlemen, that was the phone call I never wanted to get." It's just really good because immediately you know the import of what has been stolen, don't you? Through a line like that.
Yeah, and it is, and even just the montage, and like it's very, very effective at conveying a sense of scale, and to be honest, on a reasonably cheap budget, because it's just a bunch of people in rooms on phones, but you do get that sense of like this is big, this is chewy, this is going to be a lot of grizzle on this.
This is bigger than anything that has happened before in terms of the X-Files, idea. And story. So yeah, it's a huge moment really for the show, and it starts to blow things wide open. But then we snap back to Mulder before the lone gunman pay him a visit and tell him about the Thinker wanting the rendezvous to give him the MJ files. He's guzzling pills. Now, obviously
and drinking water.
Now, the episode does a good job of. It doesn't take very long for us to realise something's not right with Mulder. It was the moment he punches Skinner in the face. I think it's the moment you go, something's not right. But it does a good job of setting that up nicely with all of these things. Mulder wouldn't be there necessarily popping pills. There is already an established effect that has been happening to Mulder for maybe the last week or two before the episode starts, in which he's being manipulated, primed, etc.
Yeah, I mean, there's even, and again, this is one of the things I was talking about when I talk about like how cleverly set up and how well done all this is. Like, there's like every time that Mulder's in the apartment, he's with a glass of water. So he's having a glass of water with the aspirin. When Scully sneaks into the apartment when it's locked later on, there's a glass of water sitting beside him, and then he immediately takes a drink from it. So it's a very nice way of sort of priming the audience, so that when basically at the end there's a big reveal about what's in the water, you go, wait a minute, I've seen Mulder drink that. It's a very nice sort of bit of sort of visual setup that you don't even realise is happening, I think, until it twigs, which I think is quite nice. It's a very nice sort of setup and payoff almost.
It's clever, and and you've also got the side elements of, that poor old lady who shoots dead her husband of 30 years because she's drinking the water and she's undergoing the same thing.
That was meant for Mulder.
Yeah, and it was meant for Mulder. And she's in hysterics, and it's such I think Frohike sums it up when he goes, weirdness. but it's that whole sort of really strange event that seems, I mean, if you've clued into storytelling, there's obviously got to be a reason that they're showing that in the episode. But at the same time, it seems, for Mulder at that point, it seems just a random strange event happening in his apartment block. But it's really terrifying, this idea that could happen to a member of the public. It's just scary. In that in its own way is quite terrifying.
What it is, it captures, like, it's one of the things I really like about Anasazi is the sense there's this really weird apocalyptic sort of vibe to it. Like, there's a sense that things are really, like, social order is breaking down. Like, there's that moment there in the apartment building where a woman kills her husband of 30 years, and it's like she went crazy, is the only explanation that's offered at the time. And then later on, there's a moment where Scully's in Mulder's apartment, and she's almost shot through the window, and then there's the sound of a car driving off, which is obviously, I think, meant to evoke, like, drive-by shootings, which were a source of panic in the 90s. There's the bit where, like, Scully's dragged in to explain what she's been doing to Mulder, which includes explaining herself to Chris Carter, which is a nice touch as well. But even stuff like the burning of the boxcar with Mulder inside, or like Mulder having a breakdown and refusing to trust Scully, which is basically like, Mulder's paranoid already, but what if you turn that to 11? Like, there's a sense that almost when you're watching Anasazi, that like the X-Files as a show, that the world is disintegrating, that like whatever is holding it together isn't going to hold it together much longer. And I don't know, like, even you could argue the earthquake at the start is an expression of that. It's like the idea that the center cannot hold, that things are going to break, that there's so much pressure from so many different directions that eventually, like, something's got to give.
It's true, and I think what really underscores that is what happens to Mulder throughout. I mean, when he goes back to the office, and when the first time we see Scully when she comes in, and he tells her to lock the door, and he says, he starts to uncode the files, and he's really full of brio and excitement that he's got like the Holy Grail basically in his hands. But then when it turns out to be encoded, rational Mulder would go, we need to decode this. This is a Navajo thing probably. But he kicks off. He goes, damn it! And he just gets angry, and it's that whole thing. His disintegration, his degradation throughout the episode sort of mirrors, I think, what you were saying, in that Mulder completely just starts to break apart. Obviously, he's under an influence, but he's just spiraling out of control from the very beginning, and that really does go, complement the feel of that, of like you say, that the entire breakdown of everything else. And the only rock, the only saving grace is Scully throughout.
Yeah, and Scully is the voice of rationalism there. She holds him and she processes it. So she goes, hey, it's encoded. Well, maybe I can talk to a person who knows Navajo code. And it's like, okay, well, look, your gun, your father was shot. Maybe I should go and get your gun tested for ballistics to prove that you didn't do it. Like, Scully sort of approaches it rationally and keeps things sort of sane and level. But, like, Mulder is just spiraling. Yeah, Mulder's just unspooling. And it's quite disconcerting to watch. Like, Duchovny's really good in this.
He is. This is another episode. It's always the way, and I think we've said this in previous episodes we've done together. When he gets a really good script and he gets really good development for Mulder, he knocks it out the park, and he always manages to play Mulder breaking down really, really well. Really well. When it happened in one breath to an extent, in a different way to this, he was fantastic all the way through that. And in this, it's a similar kind of thing, in that what he goes through just completely starts to destroy him. And he's great. He's really good at capturing that sense of Mulder losing control. And it doesn't, obviously, in most of the episodes, it doesn't happen very often. He's normally the quite, laid back, investigator, dispassionate in many respects. He's got that cool, genius element to him.
Acerbic sort of quality.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Whereas when the mythology episodes like this happen, it's all very different for him. It's personalised. He loses things. He loses himself, and Duchovny's great at that. He's really good, and it's sold with the Skinner scene, and when he fights Skinner, and you get that moment where he punches Skinner, and Skinner doesn't have a massive amount to do in this, and he's been sent in to an extent to actually try and get from Mulder what they know he's got ultimately. But when Mulder hits him, you just know that, oh my god, this is not
going to end well for Mulder.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
I like that. Basically, Skinner is ultimately stepping into like his dad's shoes. There, it's like take a swing at the old man, and it's like, okay, you get one swing, and it's like that Skinner could go through Mulder for a shortcut, but he just grabs him, calms him down. It's like, are we done? And it's like,
yeah.
It's just an amazing. It's a beautiful scene because it's just like Skinner's like a brick hit house almost. And again, you get the sense that like you've seen him do like with Endgame where he throws down with Mr. X and stuff. It's like watching a fly sort of take on like an elephant or something. It's just beautiful. It's like Mulder gets one punch and it's like, okay, you got one punch. You get the sense that like Skinner didn't even need to write it up or get an ice pack afterward. It's just like, nope, I went back to my desk and did my paperwork. It's like, this is just an average day. Nothing important or noteworthy happened to me today.
Yeah. We know later on in SR 819 he likes a box. So, he's probably just used to it. He probably gets punched every day in the face. So he's fine with it. But he has that controlled machismo. Mitch Pileggi, and it comes out in Skinner really well. And like you said, that fatherly element, which fits the episode perfectly as well. And then, of course, you've got the flip side of Skinner and the kind of role he has to play when Scully's brought in before the FBI crew, and he's, and she's grilled, and she's, and this is the Chris Carter / Alfred Hitchcock moment, isn't it, of the episode? Which, I mean, I really like Chris Carter. I love the guy, but he can't act. I'll say that right off the bat.
I didn't think he was that bad. I didn't think, like, in fairness, there's not as if there was that much to do in that. He delivered 2 lines, I think.
He just felt, to me, he felt wooden. He felt like he was a guy reading them off an auto cue a little bit. I mean, he's not as bad as M. Night Shyamalan when he crops up in his films.
To be fair, Shyamalan gives himself big roles is the problem with Shyamalan. It's like, I have this role in this film for this guy who saves the world. Who could possibly play him? I think I could. I didn't think Carter was that bad, and I like the idea of, like, Scully basically being dragged into the FBI and having to explain to her creator why she hasn't done her job. It's like, as a character, your job is to disprove everything that Mulder does. It's to offer a rational scientific explanation so that things are evenly balanced and things don't seem too outlandish. Why the hell haven't you done that? And Scully's like, well, let me tell you.
But that's what's good about this scene, though, is that, and it happens a little bit later when Mulder throws back in Scully's face the whole thing about her being a spy. It's not something that they always do a lot with. From the beginning of the show, she very quickly became Mulder's friend, confidant, all of this. So it's nice to get a sequence where the FBI pull her in, remind her that she was sent there to spy on him effectively and to debunk him, and say to her, if you help him anymore, your job's gone. And I think that's a really, really good, crucial moment. And Skinner's there, not really saying much because his gaffers are there, controlling the show. You know, you've got the FBI agent played by Kem Kamru, who was in the pilot episode. He was there at the very beginning with Blevins and the Smoking Man, giving Scully the assignment, and he comes back for this. So you've got a nice little connectivity element there that suggests that they haven't forgotten why Scully was put on the X-Files, and they will pull that chip out the bag when it's needed at a time like this.
This is actually sort of something I was sort of thinking about when I was watching this today, because I have like a pet theory, or my pet theory about Anasazi is that it bookends the first 2 seasons. I think you can sort of break down the X-Files into like a number of chunks, and you can say, well, the first 2 seasons are their own animal, and then the 3rd, 4th, and 5th season, they're their own animal, and then the 6th and the 7th, they're their own as well, and then the 8th and 9th are their own as well, and you have this sort of like symmetry, I think, within those. I think that Anasazi in some ways is like a weird series finale for like the first 2 years of the X-Files. It's like there's an element of like, obviously we talked about setting up the 3rd season, but there's also an element of like wanting to package and box and put away some elements of the first 2. And I think that, like, as you mentioned, having that actor come back from that minor role, but in the same capacity in Anasazi is kind of like what they do at the end of the 5th season, or sorry, at the start of the 5th season when they bring back Blevins, which is like they want to do a bit of connectivity, they want to do a bit of bookending and say, well, look, this is a section, this is a chapter of the X-Files that we're sort of drawing to a close. We're going to basically, what we're doing from here on out is something that's going to build on that, but it's going to be its own animal almost. I wonder if that's the sort of like, when we talk about the apocalyptic elements of Anasazi, if that's part of it as well. If it's like, you're almost deconstructing the X-Files in order to reconstruct it and rebuild it.
I think that's exactly what it does. And it's moments like this that really encapsulate that sense of ending, but also that sense of a different beginning. And you get that with the this fantastic scene, this fantastically written and performed scene with Bill Mulder and the Smoking Man, which is a big, whoa, they know each other moment. Because at this stage, you don't know that at all. There is no real hint at all that they're in on the same thing. So when he turns up at Bill Mulder's house, and you know, it's just a bit of a whoa moment, and that scene, I think, is really fascinating and layered and interesting between those two, in which they talk about a lot without saying much, which is classic sort of, you know, 2 grandmasters, enemies, long-term enemies, also / friends. You know, it's Darth Vader and Obi-Wan Kenobi, isn't it? Basically,
it is, or it's like Darth Vader and slightly less evil Darth Vader. But
yeah.
I really love what I love about that reveal, and because you mentioned it there, like there's no indication of it beforehand, and there isn't in terms of plot, although it makes perfect sense. But it's been seeded so carefully through like imagery and through sort of connections. So, for example, you have like back in Roland, you have Mulder talking about staring up at his father in a pool of water and not being able to reach him and feeling disconnected from him. You have the sense that he's looking for a surrogate father figure in like Deep Throat. You have a sense of like when Bill Mulder is introduced in Colony, he's sitting on the porch smoking a cigarette. So you have all this stuff that's not linear sort of plot information, but that is sort of like, well, this is imagery and iconography that I would associate with the mythology and the conspiracy, so that when the door opens and the cigarette smoking man is standing there, it's like, this is brilliant, but this also makes perfect sense. It doesn't feel like a contrivance.
No, it doesn't. And as you realise that Bill is involved in whatever they're doing, it's a moment of, well, you immediately realise though that he's not involved like the Smoking Man's involved at this stage. You know, it's that whole, he seems shocked when the Smoking Man turns up. It's like, what are you doing here? As if to say, why have you come to my house? And even though we don't explicitly get this at this stage in terms of where Bill Mulder is with everything, you know that he's in a very different place than the Smoking Man. There's a sense they haven't seen each other for quite some time.
And that Bill was quite happy with that.
Yeah. And he didn't want him back in his life. And the Smoking Man's only come there in order to, you know, make the point that, well, you know, if Mulder turns up, Mulder's onto something now. If he turns up, you better keep stum. You better not say anything. And I get the feeling he leaves very unconvinced of that. And I think this sequence is the point where Bill decides this is the point. He's got to be honest with Mulder. He's got to he can't keep this secret anymore. And this is it. And it's funny because it's a scene full of lies as well. Certainly from the Smoking Man. I mean, at one point he says the thinker came forward, And obviously we find out in the next episode that he was found dead in a dumpster, with his shot in the head. So it's things like that. And when he, at the end, that brilliant moment at the end when he says, "It's good to see you, Bill. You look well." He looks like he's dying. Although, that was partly because Peter Donat had a major car accident just beforehand.
I didn't know that.
His face was covered in bruises, and they had to use makeup to disguise that. And actually, if you watch it, you can see really sort of purplish things on his cheeks.
The one in high definition.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. So the reason he looks like death is more the fact that Peter Donat was quite unwell.
Yeah. Another little bit I like in that scene, and it sets up something that pays off very, very well in the third season premiere. There's a bit where Bill Mulder and the cigarette smoking man are talking about the MJ files, and Bill Mulder is like, "The files should have been destroyed," and the cigarette smoking man just goes, "They should have, but they weren't," and you're like, yeah. Like, okay, this one's a little bit on me.
But this is what I kept thinking. Why weren't they? But yeah, it probably is Smoky Man being a little bit too complacent, actually, and thinking no one's ever going to break into them. Because it doesn't make sense for these, even if they're encrypted, the whole truth on a disc. Yeah.
This is our signed confession. Signed and dated. Everything you would need to expose and convict us in one place. But it's okay because you'll never get it.
You'll never get it. It's encrypted. But they make the point, don't they, about how I think he says to Bill, the technology and computers that we could only dream of when we were young have led to this. So it's that it's that idea of the old age and the new age, and the young people and the discovering the old people a little bit out of touch with the new ways, or do you know that difference between old and new, and that idea that maybe Smoking Man's been taken unawares a bit here, and he didn't necessarily see what was coming, which is rare for somebody who's such a Machiavelli. One
of the things I like about the Anasazi trilogy is that it makes the cigarette smoking man human, in the sense that he's been this sort of mythic godlike figure for most of the first two seasons, where he pokes in, he offers a deal with the devil, he's meddling in everything, he's controlling Skinner, he's doing all this stuff. But then you get this Anasazi trilogy, which is actually, when you think about it, he's pretty terrible at his job. And there's a point when even in the other two episodes where several other high prominent figures in this sort of organization are why the hell do we still pay you?
Well, in the end, that's what happens, though, isn't it? In the end, they do get sick of him, and then they try and have him killed. And it's a couple of seasons down the line, but yeah, it sort of starts here, doesn't it? That idea that you keep messing up.
Yeah, you really, really do. Your performance review is fair to middling at best. You're very good at giving speeches. We like your rhetoric. Very good at improvising. Less good at data management and procedure. But it's actually funny that you should mention, because you're talking about this idea of old versus young. I also think it is, to be fair, I think it's reinforcing the theme, and it's so important that it's mentioned twice later on. But it's the idea that nothing disappears without a trace, that there's always evidence and there's always records and stuff. And I think actually we might talk about that in a little bit, because it's very particularly tied, I think, to Chris Carter's sort of influence in the Second World War here. I think that Carter, with Anasazi, and I think with the second season as a whole, Carter sort of shifts away. The first season was very interested in the Cold War. And there are elements of that in the second season, like Colony and Endgame. But in episodes like, for example, Fallen Angel, there's and Eve, there's a lot of emphasis on stuff like weapons programs that began during the Cold War, and that are sort of now continued. And there's a question of what happens to the United States after the Cold War, where they don't have an enemy. But sort of sometime during the second season, Carter seems to sort of shift his focus. And I think around Albury, for example, you get this focus on violence that happened in the Second World War that has consequences today, like the image of the World's Fair and stuff. I think that with Anasazi, then obviously with the Italians, the Japanese, and the Germans, and obviously the Holocaust imagery and stuff like that, you have the Second World War coming into it. And I think that when Carter's talking about records that aren't destroyed, I wonder if he's specifically influenced by, say, the records of Nazi Germany. Because one of the things about the Second World War and the end of the Second World War and the Holocaust was that, first of all, the Germans were very effective bureaucrats of themselves, which made a lot of their crimes easy to prosecute, as compared to, I think, the Japanese very cleverly destroyed some of their records to make it harder to prosecute. So when we got to Nuremberg, when we got to stuff like, even when Eisenhower was liberating Europe, he made a point to record the concentration camps, that nobody could say that these things didn't happen. So you had this sort of historical record. And I get a sense that there's an element of that to how Carter views the historical record in the X-Files. Like, Carter's attitude is that there's always something there if you look for it. There's always, like, nothing entirely can be wiped from the historical record. Nothing can be erased. There will always be this documentation and this paper trail, because we know from history that when fascist regimes do stuff, when fascists do horrible things, that they do tend to document it, because that's what fascist organizations do. But in a less flippant way, that there is a record, and that as long as you maintain a record, as long as there is continuity of record, you have a bulwark against that. You have a bulwark against that, you know?
Yeah, it's fascinating. It is a fascinating idea, that, and it wouldn't surprise me at all if Carter was thinking in those terms, definitely, especially considering how, in terms of Second World War, you know, storylines and ideas, that the third season is all about that. You know, in terms of the mythology, it's there in almost every single mythology episode. So, you know, that's got to be on his mind, absolutely. And it's just, I just love that. It's the only scene that Bill Mulder and the Smoking Man properly get, really, in terms of in the entire show, really. And it's a fantastic one. And then the fact that Bill Mulder is worried that Mulder's in danger. And Smoky Man says, well, I've protected him this long. And he makes the point about martyrdom, that, you know, it's that, what I liked is then when you cut to Mulder, he's looking ill. He's looking like he's spiralling out of control, just like his father. I just had a thought that maybe the closer you are to the truth, the more it poisons you. And it feels like Mulder's getting the closest he's ever got, really, with these files to the truth. But at the same time, it's kind of destroying him at the same time. And like the truth has destroyed Bill Mulder. And I think that the parallel they do with that, as well as the mythic ideas of father and son, is fantastic throughout this, and it really works well, reaching to the point where Bill dies.
It is, and I mean, I think when the Cigarette Smoking Man says about not making a Mulder of Mulder, I like the idea that his response to that is to deconstruct Mulder. Like, it's very clear that he's the one behind the poisoning of the water in the building and stuff like that. And what he's trying to do is he's basically trying to pick apart Mulder, to weaponize his paranoia against him. Basically, the Cigarette Smoking Man is trying to deconstruct the X-Files, which I really, really like about it.
It really is. Did you think as well, I mean, I don't know if this crossed your mind, but I know there isn't a specific episodic tether, but parts of this really reminded me of Wet Wired, and what happens to Scully in Wet Wired. To me, it's almost the same technology that is used here, really, in terms of, you know, the
delivery mechanism's different, but the philosophy behind it is I think the same.
It seems the same, and Smoking Man's behind that as well. Ultimately, that's the suggestion that you get by the end of the episode. So it just feels like that there is a similar sort of thing going on with Mulder there, that they then play with again in more of a sort of standalone episode in a way, but it's that, like you said, it's weaponizing your own paranoia against you, and it goes into the idea of what they wanted. What was the end game with Mulder here, though? Because there are uncertainties. At some point, it feels like they want to kill him. Sometimes it feels like they want to frame him for his dad's murder. Then they want to turn him against Scully, or they want to make him paranoid and lose his mind. It's unclear, isn't it? I mean, I don't know where you stand on this.
I don't know. I think that in Anasazi itself, I think it's quite clear that they want to destroy him, which is a very ambiguous word to use in that circumstance. But they want to basically end up with a set of circumstances where Mulder looks like a lunatic, whether it's because he takes his own life. And I think, like, keep in mind that the poisoning of his water is very clearly modelled on stuff like the MK Ultra experiments conducted by the CIA, which makes me sound sort of paranoid. It sounds like I'm in the X-Files when I talk about this stuff. But stuff like the poisoning, I think, of Frederick Olson, for example, who was dosed with LSD by his CIA supervisor and threw himself out of a window. Like, this is all, a large portion of this is inspired by true events, or by events that were sort of exposed through the Freedom of Information Act, you know? And sort of like there's a sense that while obviously aliens don't exist and there's no vast conspiracy to clone us or to build alien human hybrids, the sense that the conspiracy in the X-Files is rooted in a lot of the stuff that has actually really happened. And like poisoning Mulder's water supply or tainting it with, and I think Scully says specifically it could be LSD, or it could be an amphetamine. But that there is that connection to MK Ultra, to something that really did happen, that is harrowing and frightening, and sort of, well, I mean, we'll talk about like its connections to stuff that really happens or later in the episode, because it gets even more overt as you get towards the climax. But there is this sense of like, the one of the things I really like about the X-Files mythology is that I feel really terrible using the word fun in this context, but it's a funhouse mirror of like the worst aspects or the most paranoid aspects of like American history after the Second World War. So there's stuff in there about, say, Operation Paperclip, which obviously gives its name to the second episode of the third season. But there's stuff in there, like MK Ultra, for example, and all this sort of stuff. There's all this sort of stuff that really happened. The radiation experiments that Clinton apologized for in 1995 and 1996. That is sort of imagined or reimagined in a way that's more fantastical and more magical, but is still disconcerting for that. And I really like that about Anasazi. Like, the poisoning of Mulder's water supply is something that you get a sense could really happen, regardless of aliens like not existing and there not being a plan to colonize the world. Like, poisoning a guy's water supply is fairly mundane as far as like evil conspiracies go.
It's small fry for them, isn't it? But in this context, it's all about an end game involving one person, and I think they make the point that later on, when Scully's figured out what's gone on, he says, "Oh my God, there was a murder," and it was all basically to get to me, really, and that's itself a scary idea. In the scene where Scully comes to him and then she's concerned about her job and Mulder snaps at her and things like that, and then he puts the X on the window. Obviously, that's the sign for Mr. X. But after the events of Softlight, where they had a bit of a set to, and X essentially betrayed him, then X doesn't show up in this trilogy at all. And I've always thought that was a really interesting decision on the part of Chris Carter, because you could have easily had him turn up and provide some sort of assistance, but he doesn't show at all. He's disappeared. He's gone. And in considering this is a huge story, it's a very purposeful thing, I think, that X is put on the door, and then ironically, it's the bullet that almost hits Scully comes through the X. It almost feels like it's a way of saying, no, you don't get any help at this point. If anything, it's the opposite. You are too close. and that's great. And what they do then with X in season 3, I think is really good. Actually, I really like what they end up doing with him and the way they bring him back into things. But I think it's that whole suggestion, is it, that, like you said, things are spiraling out of control. Mulder doesn't have any help in this. He doesn't have a Senator Matheson he can pop into. He doesn't have X who he can put a sign on the window and he'll turn up with some help. No, he's on his own, and that's why when he gets the call from Bill saying I need to speak to you, it's just so tragic a scene, isn't it? I mean, it's a brilliant scene, but I think that final scene between Mulder and Bill is one of the most tragic the show ever did,
and it's one of the most important. Like, if you were to distill down what the X-Files is about in big capital letters, I think that scene between Bill and Mulder is probably core to that, because it's a conversation between a father and a son, where the father acknowledges that he's done horrible things, that he's been sort of compromised, and that the life that Mulder has is a result of that set of compromises. And the fact that Mulder grew up believing that his father was innocent and believing that he was innocent has somehow sort of protected him up to this point, but that illusion is going to shatter at some point, and that's going to cause a rift. That's going to make something that's irreconcilable. Like, there's a great moment where Bill is talking about like the politics of compromise, where he's talking about, your politics are yours. You've never thrown in. The minute you do that, their doctrines become yours, and you can be held responsible. There's this sense of like complicity, this sense that like being part of a society or an organization, like Bill is part of the project, obviously, but I mean, even just being complicit in a society that's organized in a particular way sort of implicates a person. And that implication sort of contaminates and infects. And I think like you see that in Carter's other writing, where you get the sense that evil is like corrosive and infectious and contagious. But you get this sense that like Bill Mulder was part of the generation. He was part of the greatest generation in a way. He was the guys who won the Second World War, which is like that mythic generation for Americans and for the world in general, because it's the fight of democracy against totalitarianism. It's like the good war. It's the war that you cannot criticize. And it was, to be honest, Anasazi was broadcast on the 50th anniversary of the end of that war as well, which is why I think that the third season focuses so heavily on the Second World War. But you have that idea of, despite the fact that this we believe our parents, like we all believe our parents are amazing, and most of them are in many ways, but there's also the fact that they've lived in the world, and living in the world involves being human, and being human involves being flawed in some ways. And I think that even beyond like the politics of the X-Files, in terms of like stuff like what we were talking about, like the MK Ultra and the radiation experiments and stuff, the fact that learning or accepting that your parents are human beings, and part of that is accepting that they're going to die, very, very sad, very sort of tragically. But accepting that they're human beings is a huge moment for a person. I think that Anasazi sort of captures that with Mulder. It's the point at which, and it's telling the point at which he realizes his father is truly flawed. Is the moment as well that he realizes that his father's mortal, because his father dies almost immediately afterwards. But it's like, and again, this is that Duchovny sort of mythic story quality to it. It's like that moment of awareness in a child's life, and it's just sort of, it's striking. It's beautiful.
I think that's so true, and the way he breaks down when Bill says "forgive me" after he's shot, and he just starts crying, and it's the kind of emotional thing that they could never get when Bill was alive, between each other, because Bill, through his guilt, a lot of it, and through his work, had kept that distance, and through obviously the guilt about Samantha, which obviously is what we get in the next couple of episodes, and what we find out, the deal he made. And all of that cooking around in his head, and having to keep his son at a distance because he knew that he could tell him everything, he could tell him the whole thing, but he couldn't. At the same time, he couldn't, because he would lose him, effectively, or he would lose. And the irony is he'd already lost him in a way, and that's the sad irony of the whole thing. And then he has the, you talked earlier about the Nazi parallel between the syndicate members and real life Nazis. It's that whole idea of when he says, the merchandise, he says it with such a level of, I have done things that are so bad that you will never understand why. And even though I suppose Bill would have tried to rationalise it, once the more of the pieces come out, he would have tried to rationalise it and saying, look, we were doing it to save the world. Then it's that whole thing, isn't it? It's the whole thing about the enemy always thinks they're the good guy. The bad guy always thinks they're the good guy, and it is that real sense, and that's why it's so well done when you see that iconic moment where Krychek's in the bathroom and he closes the door and Krychek's there.
And the curtain, yeah, it's a great shot.
It's a brilliant shot.
Goodwin's fantastic. I feel like we don't praise the directors on the X-Files enough, because I think they're a large part of why the show was so successful. We love the writers. The writers are fantastic, and it hits on these big sort of 90s themes. But in terms of just sheer direction, the X-Files was head and shoulders ahead of a lot of contemporary television. I think even now, watching it in HD with the show remastered for widescreen, which is quite remarkable how well that works, the aspect ratio shift. I think that's a credit to everybody involved, and a credit to the directors as well. It's a fantastically directed show.
In a way, I think Bob Goodwin is one of the unsung heroes. People often say, Rob Bowman or Kim Manners, as the two greatest directors, and they may well have been, but I think. And Bob Goodwin didn't do any after season 5 when they left Vancouver. But he directed this. He directed the Erlenmeyer Flask. He directed some of the best episodes the show did, over the first 5 years. Arguably, in many respects.
Gethsemane, I would argue, as well, I think.
Yeah, Gethsemane, yeah. He did some of the best finales. And I think he is a bit of an unsung hero. And he does some fantastic work with this. And that Krychek shot is a great example of that. Because it's not just Mulder's dad being killed, but it's Krychek! We haven't seen him since, Ascension. And then suddenly it's whoa, that's Krychek!
It's also like a reverse shower scene. It's also like a reverse Psycho scene as well, actually, which I quite liked about it. It's no, this time the monster's in the shower. Yeah.
There's Rat Boy, yeah. And this is where he becomes Rat Boy, I think, really more than ever, really. But isn't it interesting, though, that you never see him shoot Bill? And you hear the gunshot go off, but you never see him pull the trigger, do you? You never see Krychek shoot him. I wonder if that was an intentional thing to leave a level of ambiguity.
I don't know. I feel like Mulder reacting to the shot and hearing the shot is more important than seeing the shot itself, almost, in that context. Because again, that's the moment of realization, and it's like a gunshot. It's when you that feeling when you have a light bulb go off in your head, for example. It's almost like that. It's like Mulder is outside, and then you hear the gunshot, and it's like, okay, his dad is gone. His dad's gone, lying on the floor with a bunch of pills on the ground around him as well. Obviously it's not a natural death, but it's a scene that you could easily reimagine as a natural moment for a grown-up son discovering his father on the bathroom floor with a bottle of I presume heart medication, half open, just sort of lying there. It's a shocking, this man who you thought of, who was such a big and important figure in your life, is gone.
It's so quick, it's so brutal, it's so sudden. Just at the point as well when in the classics, again, it goes back to mythical storytelling and that classic moment where he was about to learn everything, and then it's taken away from him straight away.
That's the real reason that Albert Holstein never told Mulder everything. Because it's like, the moment that I promise to tell you everything, I will need to go to the bathroom and I will be murdered by Krycek.
I'm going to die. Yeah, exactly. He was a clever guy, that Albert. But yeah, it is that brilliant moment that it's all snatched away from under him. And it continues Mulder's spiral, and Scully tries to help him. She tries to do the rational things of getting his name cleared, potentially by taking his gun to ballistics and all of these different things. But he can't cope with that, and that's when he throws it back in her face, and says, you're spying on me still. You are, you don't trust me, everything like that. He says, you may have my files, you have my gun. Don't ask me for my trust. And poor Scully, I really feel for her throughout this episode because she's the only one holding him together throughout the entire thing.
Well, this is what you were saying about X. Mulder has systematically alienated everybody in his life. And even Skinner. Trying to punch Skinner in the face means he can't go to Skinner for help afterwards. And you get the sense that that's sort of one of what the Cigarette Man and Smoky Man was planning, was this idea of Mulder alienating himself and drifting off. But you get the sense that no matter how hard he pushes Scully away, and again, this is where we're into I sound like a shipper territory, but no matter how far he pushes Scully away, no matter what he does, no matter how horrible he is to her, she still cares about him. She's still compassionate towards him. It is impossible for him to break that bond. And whether you choose to believe that bond is romantic or spiritual or platonic, there is something very special in that. There's something in the idea that no matter how hard Mulder pushes, and he will push very hard, Scully will always, without a doubt and without any hesitation, be there to support him and be there to protect him from himself, to be entirely honest.
Well, yeah, absolutely, which is what she does when she shoots him to prevent him killing Krycek. Definitely, when there's that amazing, sequence where he beats the crap out of him and then he's about to shoot him dead. But at this stage, that's the thing. I genuinely don't have any issue with them becoming a romantic couple, much as it didn't necessarily help the show in some respects. I didn't have a problem with it, really. But I think at this point, it is a beautifully platonic relationship. And it's one of those things where she, and they say it in the dialogue much later on, but she's his constant. She's the one who will keep him on the straight and narrow. And it's just really well done. It's there in the writing. It's there in the performances. It's there in that compassion between them. And that's why it works. That's why it's one of those shows that can, and Bob Goodwin says it in his commentary. He says, what other show could get away with, the one of the leads shooting the other lead, and it not being out of protecting them. And that's why it's so good. And it's also a good way of actually allowing the story naturally to sort of take a breath and to place Mulder where he needs to be for the climax as well. Which is quite handy. Skipping forward a couple of days, him waking up like Sleeping Beauty, and he's with Albert and in New Mexico, and he gets the download of information that allows him to move on, really. And I think it's an important moment.
I actually really like about that scene is the fact that Scully genuinely says, "I didn't get a chance to tell you, but I'm sorry for your father."
Yeah,
and it's that underscores how frantically the plot has been moving to this point, how fast the episode's been going. That Scully has literally not had a chance to say the words, "Mulder, I'm sorry to hear your father passed away." It's no, we have to deal with the situation that you may be framed for it, that you're going to shoot Krycek, that I've got your gun to ballistics, that we're stuck in a Mexican standoff. After that, after we've processed all that, just want to say, very sorry about your dad.
Yeah, very sorry about your dad. By the way, my name is in the MJ files, as is Dwayne Barry's. It's personal for me too. What? Just when you think Chris Carter can't throw anything else, he drops that one in. And you're like, oh my God, what is going to happen next? But you also then get the moment that Albert is saying how, we had an omen that you were coming. And you get these we talked about it at the top of the episode, but you get these sequences where he talks about what the discovery in a very spiritual way. And I suppose you're right in that it goes down a more new agey route in the next episode. But this is what this if this stuff hadn't been here, I don't think they could have done biogenesis and that 3-parter, which obviously tethers back a lot to this and introduces the whole idea of is God an alien, is alien God, etc., and really plays with that idea. But I think it's there here, isn't it? It's that idea that the spirituality and mysticism and all of that is tied up with this idea of alien truth and alien belief and nature, rising these secrets to the surface. So the omen is an interesting way of phrasing it, isn't it?
Yeah, there is that nice sort of vague spirituality. And actually, like I like the Anasazi stuff, because I think one of the theories where they're talking about the Anasazi disappearing, one of the theories in the real world is that the Anasazi were actually they were an ethnically diverse tribe, and when they didn't so much disappear as they emigrated, migrated, and joined other tribes as they were going. So they became literal aliens and hybrids and stuff. So you had this sort of thing that ties into what will become a core theme of the show as well. I mean, like, I'm not a big fan. I'm going to be entirely honest. I am not a big fan of how Carter handles a lot of the Native American aspects of this, which is, again, something that will become more pronounced in late episodes that are tied to this one yet to come. But I don't like the way that Carter goes down, say, the ancient astronaut route. And I feel that, like, some of the stuff that he does when I like the audacity of, as you mentioned, is God an alien? Is an alien God? I like the audacity of it, but in practice, I find it occasionally quite heavy-handed and suffocating. And I think that Anasazi just about sort of threads that line. Like, I feel that the next episode may be a bit sort of clumsier in that regard, a little bit, but I feel like Anasazi in the scenes with Albert and the conversations with Mulder, perhaps it's an issue with space. Perhaps because there's only so much space in which to handle this, it can't really wallow in that sort of New Age mysticism stuff that Carter sort of indulges in later on, but I think it works really well.
Yeah, I think they like you say, they just about get away with the references because it's not really as overt and is the point in that way. So yeah, obviously that conversation with Albert then leads into Mulder finding the boxcar ultimately and heading to the quarry, which actually the quarry that we saw in the teaser and here was obviously it's meant to be New Mexico. It's shot in Vancouver, and they painted an entire quarry red. They painted it all red. It wasn't actually red at all. So they found an old abandoned quarry east of Vancouver and just painted it all. It is pretty amazing. I mean, and they do. I mean, some of the matte shots and everything of the actual New Mexico, they're a little bit wobbly, but it's you have to look for that. I mean, they do a really good job of staging this climax, I think, impressively, really, and the reveal that Mulder ends up getting.
It's one of those old school sort of production value stories, which is interesting. Like, because these days you just do it all with CGI. If you were in the condition, you paint them digitally afterwards. Like, the idea that they actually physically painted an entire quarry red, like that's an amazing sort of like, just technically the work that went into that to present that, and you get a sense that like there's an element of like, well, look, Vancouver allows us to do absolutely everything except the desert of the American Southwest. And it's like, okay, let's do the desert of the American Southwest. Like, there's something very endearing about that, I think. Even if it isn't entirely convincing in every way, I think it's fantastic that they did it.
But again, it's their ambition and their scope and their reach. And we talked about it with Endgame, with the submarine tower and the set they built and everything like that. They were unafraid to try these things and to push the boundaries, and most of the time they made it work really well. But yeah, as Mulder's heading down with his arm in a sling from being shot, he gets the call, doesn't he, from cigarette smoking man who says, "Where are you?" "I'm at the Betty Ford Center. Where are you?" It's just crack. Every time he says that, I just crack up. There's some good Mulder one-liners in this actually. The other one is when the thinker says, "Oh, I don't think it's best that you know my name," and he says something like, "Oh, sounds like a line I used in a bar once." There's some good ones, but it's that whole that conversation is important as well, isn't it? With the smoking man, it's that where he turns around and says, "What you've been told may not be true, but if you do this, if you go down and find this, then you will destroy your father." Basically, that's what he's saying, isn't it, really?
Yeah, expose anything and you only expose your father, which I think is one of the great, like, again, we were talking about, like, the X-Files in miniature, but the idea that, that the X-Files is about exposing the sins that were committed by past generations, arguably to build the world that we have today. So, like bringing German soldiers after the Second World War to build rockets to get us to the moon, for example. Like, the idea that the modern society is built on this sort of compromise and these sort of horrible things that people have done and people have allowed to be done because they want to build a better world for their kids, and basically what it means to be a kid growing up in that world almost. And the idea that, like, by exposing the truth, Mulder is ultimately destroying his father. He's ultimately killing his father again and again, I love referencing Freud. I don't think Freud is good psychology, but Freud is fascinating storytelling. But this idea that in exposing the truth, Mulder is effectively killing his own father again in a manner that's sort of more abstract and more symbolic than the way that Krychek did. But that, like, by rendering these sins and exposing these sins, he's, like, basically defiling his father's memory almost, or sort of this nostalgic ideal that he had.
Yeah, and whether or not this was something in Carter and Duchovny's head at the time, but you could also look at what Smoking Man is saying as his own fear. As in, if you find the truth, you'll destroy your father.
I don't mean Bill.
And I don't mean Bill. Yeah, this is the thing. He's also concerned that his own work will be exposed, and he'll be exposed because, as we know, he is Mulder's biological father, and we're a long way from Mulder really learning that, and he would never accept it anyway. But it's that whole thing of it's the two fathers thing, isn't it? The two fathers, one son idea, which comes back much later on.
And I mean, it's worth stressing that, like, the point at which the show starts hammering the idea that the cigarette smoking man might be Mulder's father is the end of the third season with Talitha Cummy, which is also a David Duchovny script.
Yeah.
So I don't think that it's unreasonable to suggest that the writers at this point were going, this is where we might want to take the characters.
Definitely. And everything you just said about the Nazi scientists coming over and the progress of society and everything. This feels like that idea taken to the next level, doesn't it? With what he finds in the boxcar, this stack of bodies, this horrific experimentation, and then when he turns around and says, "Oh my God, Scully, what have they done?"
Well, this is like the climax of Anasazi is just amazing in terms of, like, symbolism and imagery, and obviously
it's
in terms
so
of suspense and plot and character and stuff. But in terms of just sheer symbolism, like, you have this idea of the Navajo Indians taking, or Navajo Native Americans taking Mulder to visit a train car, that's from the Pierre, from the Sierra Pacific line, which is a reference obviously to the Pacific, the Great Pacific Railroad and stuff like that. Like the railroads that were built by the European settlers through the United States of America, pushing westwards in search of manifest destiny, that led to, like, the genocide of the Native Americans, and to the fact that, like, Native Americans now mostly live on reservations. The fact that they took this country, and that these white European settlers using these train cars were the original colonists in a way, which becomes obviously much more important later on when it becomes clear that the aliens are going to be colonists. But on top of that, then you have, not only do you have the imagery of, like, the Native Americans and the rail carts and sort of this push westward to manifest destiny, you have then all this Second World War imagery heaped on top. So you have, like, the Navajo windtalkers who were people who were dispossessed and who were victimized and who were, like, who had a history of being abused and neglected by the United States government, who then became vital to its efforts of survival. The only code the Japanese couldn't break, to quote Scully, during the Second World War. But then you also have this idea of, like, when Mulder confronts the train car with the dead bodies in it, it's very clearly Holocaust imagery. It's very clearly meant to evoke, and again, the alien form at the start, the big reveal is that these are not aliens at all. These are quite possibly people with smallpox vaccination scars in them, piled from floor to ceiling inside a train car that was buried somewhere. Like, that is not subtle imagery. That is Holocaust imagery, even before the cigarette smoking man decides to burn Mulder alive inside it, or to burn it completely. Like, there's a sense that, and Carter sort of talks about this, I think, in the documentaries on the 9th season. Like, on, I think, The Truth About Season 9, this is the last thing that Carter says about the X-Files, which I think sort of signifies how important it is to him. But, like, one of his defining moments in determining what the X-Files was going to be was watching in the mid-90s a documentary about the Holocaust, and watching basically the people in that documentary talk about the importance of memory and of keeping memory alive and of maintaining, like, memory and truth and continuity and remembering what happened and documenting what happened so it didn't happen again. And there's that sense, I think, that, like, with Anasazi and going into the third season, which happens on the 50th anniversary of the end of the Second World War, Carter's basically challenging. He's putting a big challenge out there, saying, well, look, what have we learned from the Second World War? Like, what have we taken away from it? Like, what have we decided that we can live with, and what did our parents decide that they could live with in order to like put men on the moon, in order to give us superiority over, say, the Russians or whatever. There's a sense that with the end of Anasazi, it's like it's all the original sins of the United States almost. Like, so there's the oppression of the Native Americans, there's the Manifest Destiny, there's the smuggling of and Scully even overtly references it here in dialogue when she talks about projects involving smuggling Axis scientists out of the into the United States, which becomes more explicit when you talk about stuff like Paperclip, which is a reference to something that actually really happened, and something that was very popular and very topical in the news around the time that Paperclip would have been airing. This idea of how the United States dealt with all these German scientists who had conducted horrific experiments upon people during the Holocaust, and Jews and dispossessed and people like that, and how those people were basically welcomed with open arms to the United States because they had something material to offer. And there's this sense at the end of Anasazi that all of this is coming back to haunt us, that like the monsters hiding at the end of the X-Files are not necessarily the aliens, and that like the things that we look on and we don't see, like Mulder doesn't recognize the bodies as human initially, like because they've been so distorted, because they've been so warped, because they've been so deformed. And I mean, again, the imagery is striking. It recalls those horrifying images of concentration camp survivors who've been so starved and so sort of like abused and so physically warped that they don't necessarily resemble. Like, I think there's Paul Cornell, the writer Paul Cornell. He's a British writer. He wrote some Doctor Who and stuff, but he made a very compelling argument that I read a little while ago, where he argued that like one of the reasons why the Greys have sort of latched on and become like one of the defining creatures in 20th century American folklore is because they so effectively evoke the horrors that we see looking at the 20th century as a whole. So when you see the head that is disproportionately sized to the body, the small gangly limbs and stuff, you think of the images of Holocaust survivors who are emaciated and starved. You think of like the famine survivors in Africa. You think of like people who have endured things that nobody should have to endure in this world, but with which they did, and which perhaps we are implicated in allowing that to have happened, or even just allowing people to forget that it happened. And I think the X-Files sort of taps into that. And I think Anasazi, the climax of Anasazi is brilliant television just in terms of like sheer plot mechanics, like burn it all, or you only expose your father. But in terms of like sheer concentration of like metaphorical and abstract imagery and symbolism, it's there. It's like so distilled and so perfect to the point where like the third season hammers this stuff again and again and again. Like, so you get this idea of, like, is it an alien or is it just a human who's been experimented upon? You get that in Nicene 731. You get this connection to, like, the US bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in, like, Piper Maru and Apocrypha, for example. But, like, all of it is here. All of it is laid out in Anasazi, just in a pure, like, concentrated form. And it's astounding to watch. And it's harrowing and effective. And I think, to be honest, it's arguably as harrowing and effective in 2016 or 2017 as it was when it was broadcast.
Well, I was gonna make that same point, actually, in that I agree. I think that's exactly a scary fact, in that, again, it's the idea of history being forgotten. It's about the past not being remembered, and it's something that seems to be becoming even more of a concern in this day and age, and what's been happening in the last few years in terms of the politics of the world. And it's why I've said it before, it's why the X-Files is back. It's why Chris Carter feels that it's the right time to bring this show back again, because we're living in a world where, you know, all of these sins, all of these disturbing things are sort of regurgitating themselves in a way, and I think that Anasazi just gets it spot on, and it's so crystallizes all of the things that the X-Files can really, really do, and the power behind it all. And so when you get that final sequence of Burn It, and we're left wondering whether Mulder's going to survive, I think, like I said earlier, I think there's a genuine thing with the X-Files. Well, maybe he is dead, you know. And there is an argument, obviously, that he does die in some respects, and he is reborn in the next episode in a way. And
I'd go even further. I'd say the show dies and is reborn in the next episode.
Well, yeah. That's I think that, and then season 3 moves on and charts its own course in that way. But Anasazi is such a phenomenal finale in so many ways, and the depth, the sheer depth that we've been able to go into and talk about with this, and you know, all of the themes that are rolling around in there, it's quite astonishing, really. And it very rarely happens in a lot of television that you get all of that in a 45-minute piece of TV,
and it works. That you can do a kitchen sink episode like this. Doing a kitchen sink episode is relatively straightforward. You just have a bunch of bullet points that you hit. Doing a kitchen sink episode and making it work, like making it seem like it's like a single line that's pointing towards a climax that then opens up this world of possibilities that gives you a whole other like 26 episodes to play with. That's astounding.
Scully,
Yeah, it's me.
where are you?
Nowhere I ever expected.
What do you mean?
I'm in a boxcar, buried inside a quarry. There are bodies everywhere.
Bodies?
Stacked floor to ceiling.
What happened to them?
I don't know.
Mulder, in these files, I found references to experiments that were conducted here in the U.S. by Axis Power scientists who were given amnesty after the war.
What kind of experiments?
Some kind of tests on humans, but they're referred to as merchandise.
But these aren't humans, Scully. From the look of it, I'd say they were alien.
Are you sure?
I'm pretty damn sure. Wait a second. This one has a smallpox vaccination scar.
Mulder,
Oh my God, Scully. What have they done?
Before we go, though, because we're at the end of season 2, as we did last year when myself and Andrew Brooker covered the Erlenmeyer flask, we're gonna rate season 2, and we're gonna talk about we're gonna briefly outline our top 3 and our bottom 3 episodes of the season. So, firstly, Darren, what would you give season 2 as a whole out of 10 if you were going to give it a score?
I'd give it a 7.
Okay,
Which is going to be quite low, I think, compared to what people were expecting.
Yeah, I think personally, I think I would give it a 9 myself because it's one of my favourite seasons. But why would you go for a 7 then?
Well, I think first of all, 7 is well above average. I feel the need to defend myself preemptively on this, but I do also think that like. The second season has a lot of really great episodes and has a really great momentum coming into it. Like that opening stretch of episodes that runs from Little Green Men through to, and I mean, let's count 3 in it. Let's go. It goes to One Breath. Like that's astounding television, and that's the first 9 episodes of the season. Then I think once the writers do that, I think it does sort of hit a bit of a bump. It hits a bump where the writers aren't sure entirely where they're going with that, and I think that like you end up with stuff like Firewalker, which is like, what if we did ice, but with fire, and then you hit other stuff which is like Red Museum or sort of other stuff that gets sort of muddled, and then you sort of find your way back in and you do end up with great episodes. You end up with stuff like, for example, Irresistible or Humbug, but you also on the other end of the table end up with stuff like Excelsi Day, but you end up with this late season sort of stuff where they're trying to figure out how to get stuff to work, and you end up with like a collection of episodes like Dodcom or Fearful Symmetry, or even stuff like, I know you like Soft Light, I am less fond of Soft Light, but there's a sense of like trying to figure out, and like having left the gate so strong and then sort of stumbling and figuring out what to do with, like once we landed, once the momentum stopped, once we figured out what we were doing with Gillian Anderson's pregnancy, and once we got her back as a regular, how do we process all this stuff that happened? And there's a sense that they don't, in the second season, they're not entirely sure how to do that. And so you get a lot of stuff that works really, really well. And I think that like the second season has some of the best episodes in the run. But you also end up with a lot of stuff that's like, what the hell's going on? Invisible what now? What's happening? Why did we budget? Wait, old people makeup? What's going on now? And I think that there's a lot of that in the second season. I think it's a season of highs and lows. And I think perhaps more than any other season. Is it the most uneven season of the X-Files? Because I think that the other seasons are generally quite like they plateau. Like you can get a sense that like the third season is uniformly brilliant. The 8th season is uniformly great. The 7th season is uniformly sort of tired and misguided. The 6th season is sort of uniformly sort of camp and funny. The 5th season is like uniformly atmospheric and rich. I think the second season is perhaps the only season of the X-Files that is so far all over the map. I mean, even the 9th season is kind of uniformly terrible. But like with the second season, you get this sort of like pong. You're watching the ball bounce down the screen, and you literally have no idea what you're going to get from one week to the next.
Well, when you put it in that way, I can't necessarily disagree with that. Really, I think for me, there's a lot of of nostalgia in me giving it a 9. Really, I think it was the first season I ever watched. So many episodes just have stayed with me, and exploring it over the last year has been really great. Going through all of these episodes that I love so much, so I think there is an element of nostalgia. I think you make a really good point there. I think it does go up and down. You know, you might get a one breath one week, then you might get a Excelsis day. So it's. Yeah, that's not an even season. That's not an evenly written season. That's not a season that knows its characters and its storylines consistently well enough to make it great every week. So that's a good point. That is a good point. Let's talk then about the highs and the lows then. So let's go from let's do our top 3 and bottom 3. Let's go bottom to top, but we'll go one each. So in third place bottom? What would you put there, Darren?
So in third place bottom, are we going like, is this the worst episode or is this the third worst episode?
This will be the third worst episode, and we'll build up to the worst and build up to the best.
.com.
Okay.
Sorry, you wanted there to be hesitation. There was no hesitation.
Why .com?
Because it's such a cliche episode. It's the put the actors in old folk makeup episode. And it's also the let's waste a great guest star in John Savage episode. It's like, it's the stock episode that you get. Like, it's a Star Trek The Next Generation episode masquerading as an X-Files episode, to be entirely honest.
Yeah, I kind of get that. I've always had a soft spot for that one, I think. But I can see it. I understand it, really. I think my third worst would probably be the Kalasari, which I just don't think is particularly good at all.
I mean, can agree with that. That was fighting for a place on this list.
I mean, I'll say for Carl Sweeney and Clara Cook did a really good job with the Kalasari. In fact, it's one of our most popular episodes, the Kalasari, the one we did. And people have seemed to enjoy the episode. I enjoyed the podcast they did on it much more than the episode itself. I just think it's really off the mark, and it tries to do an Exorcist kind of story and just gets it wrong completely for me.
My big issue with it was, I think, the tone deafness of the way it handled the death of a child. That was, I think, what really put me off in the teaser to it. Because I mean, the idea of the X-Files doing the Exorcist should be a slam dunk episode, but somehow it's not. Yeah,
it shouldn't go that wrong, should it? Really? Okay, third best then.
Third best, we'll go with Irresistible.
Good choice, Donny Faster. I think that would be vying for a place in most people's. It's a good one, that, isn't it?
It's striking. It's so well constructed and so uncanny and so like. And I think one of the things that like the best episodes of the second season, without spoiling what the other two are going to be, are the ones that I think really push what the X-Files can do and what you can expect from the show. And like, I think that's a good thing for a second season to do in general. It's like, first season's like, okay, we can competently deliver 20-odd episodes without like falling over and embarrassing ourselves. Second season's like, okay, we've done that. How about we figure out, let's take the baby for a test drive. Let's sort of see what we can do. Let's do some wheelies and some spinnies and all this sort of stuff. And it's like, with Irresistible, you get an episode that I don't think anybody would have expected before watching it. Like, I don't think anybody would have said The X-Files is a show that could do an episode like this before they actually watched it. And it's really good, and it's really creepy. And being entirely honest, it's creepy enough that it provides the basis for like a 3-season sort of spin-off or tie-in to the X-Files, in that it's very clearly like Millennium Mark 05. And it's also like, it deals with Scully's abduction, Scully's trauma, in a way that I don't think the rest of the season really does, or really sort of earns. And I say that, and again, I've said this every time I raise this criticism, I think the third season does it better, but I think Irresistible gets a lot of points for actually being willing to sort of get out in front of that. And it's also just a good episode. It's just fantastically directed. It
really is. It's a cracker. It was really good to talk through that one. Mine would be F. Immaculata, which
good choice.
We covered recently. I love that one. It's one of my favourites. It's one that stuck with me all through my childhood and growing up. I think it's paced brilliantly. It's got an amazing Mark Snow score, one of my favourites throughout the entire run. It's filled with dread. It has still a lot of relevance today. It moves like a bullet. It's creepy. It's exciting. It's just top rank, that one. I love that episode.
And it's also, I think, another example of something you didn't think the show could do up until that point, because it's not a paranormal adventure, it's just a straightforward thriller, but it's done so well.
Worst number 2 then, Darren?
Worst number 2, that's a very interesting choice of phrasing there, Tony. The worst number 2 of the season would be Fearful Symmetry. And I feel kind of bad that I hate it as much as I do, but I really hate it. Because I understand why it is as terrible as it is, which is that the budget was very low, and we can't really afford to film with live animals, and that even when we can, we have to do inserts. But part of me also thinks the response to that... And I feel like we talked about how great it is that the production team are audacious and ambitious and all this sort of stuff. But I feel like the proper response to we can't film an episode with live zoo animals and CGI isn't good enough to do it properly is not to do it. It's not to try and find a way to make the animals invisible so you can try and do it without it costing money. And it also has a lot of the new agey sort of stuff and then the heavy-handed sort of... Even the heavy-handed sort of Christian stuff that I find grates on me a little bit in the X-Files, where it's like, here's a bunch of Christian symbolism lobbed in on top without properly unpacking it. And it really does grate me. And the villain character is just so awful. He's so one-dimensionally evil. Yeah, it's bad. It's
rubbish.
Yeah.
It's my number 2 as well. It's rubbish. It's absolute rubbish. And me and Zach Moore had a good laugh taking the mick out of it for an hour. I will say that it was a fun podcast to record about it. But yeah, and Jane Atkinson is possibly the most annoying guest star the show ever did.
Controversial.
She just did my head in. So yeah. Rubbish, absolute load of rubbish. What would be your second favourite, Darren? What's the second best one?
Humbug.
Hey, good choice. It's not in my top 3,
Ooh.
but it's in my it's close. It's up the top there. Why Humbug then?
It's so brilliant. First of all, it's funny. It's hilariously funny, but it's also incredibly well observed, and it's also incredibly on point. As it's amazing to think that at this point in the second season is almost over, that the X-Files have reached a point where Darren Morgan could sit down, look at what made an X-Files story work to a certain extent, that he could then sort of pick it apart and sort of chip at it. And it's also, on top of that, it's got that wonderful sort of Darren Morgan existential angst thing going on, where the story is essentially about this guy's conjoined twin, dealing with the fact that he's dying and trying to find another host or companion so that he can continue to live, which is just this awful, awful existential despair. There's the moment where I think Lonnie declares it's sad not to be wanted, and you're just it's heartbreaking, but it's also hilarious.
It is, and for the simple fact that it is, it's the first true comedy format breaking episode that they did and made it work. It's pretty legendary in that sense. So no, I understand why it's in your top 3, definitely. My number 2 would be this is a difficult one, to be honest, because there's a bunch that would qualify for my number 2 spot, really, and it's really, really hard to choose. But I think I'm going to have to go with Dwayne Barry. Simply for the fact I love that episode, and I always have. I think it's a fantastic piece of drama. I think it's executed brilliantly. David Duchovny and Steve Railsback are tremendous off each other, and obviously it's got that amazing cliffhanger as well. I just love Dwayne Barry. I think it's a terrific piece of TV.
Yeah, I mean, well, it's one of the first individual episodes to be singled out by the Emmys, of the X-Files. It's one of those. If you're looking at moments at which the X-Files gained critical and cultural acceptance, that is a big one, and it's also just a fantastic piece of television of itself. And it's Chris Carter's first directorial debut, and it's an astonishing directorial debut. Whatever you think of him as a writer, as a director, he's amazing. And to start out doing that, whatever about Triangle's one of my favorite episodes of television, in part because of the direction of it. But just to start at a level where you can do Dwayne Barry and just sort of climb from there is just astounding.
It's pretty impressive. It really is. Okay, then what's your worst episode of season 2? I think I know what you're going to say, because I think it's going to be mine. But let's see.
It may also be the worst episode of the X-Files ever produced, and it may also have docked the entire season a whole point on my 10-point scale. So it is Excelsior Day.
Yes, of course
Bingo.
It is. Thank you.
Yes, the one in which Mulder somehow doesn't believe in ghost rape.
Doesn't
in
believe
which
in ghost rape.
Somebody decides that pervy cocoon is a proper way to do an X-Files episode. It's just horrible from beginning to end. Oh, in which the Asian orderly is, of course, responsible for all this because of something to do with the souls of his ancestors and mushrooms. It's horrible. It's just horrible on every level. It's racist. It's sexist. It's ageist. Just when you think it can't get worse, it keeps getting worse. Just when you think it's prejudiced enough, it finds new ways to be prejudiced. It's horrific. Sorry, that was very, very, very emotional. But
no, it's true. It's a lot less sweary than what me and Brooker said about it. We just spent the entire episode telling it to F off, basically, when we recorded it. Again, a really fun podcast, tearing it to pieces. It's horrendous, and I don't think it's going some to suggest it is possibly the worst X-File, or it's definitely in the bottom
5. I would say at least.
Yeah,
and
it's got to be.
I think it might be. I'm trying to think what else could possibly contend with it, because I mean, the other ones that are like, I think it's a weird combination of being both like boring and offensive. Like other X-Files episodes that are boring are not as offensive, and other episodes that are as offensive, at least are not boring. Like, whatever you can say about Badla, there's never a moment in Badla where you're like, I wish this would end, or this is like pervy Cocoon. But I mean, it's just such a potent... It's like a cocktail of like terrible things. It's just horrible.
Yeah, it's true. It is hard to think of one that is repulsive as well as being dull.
Yeah.
Yeah, that'll take some thinking. One may crop up and we may go, this is worse than Excelsis Day. But right now, yeah, that's even worse than Space. I mean, even Space, I didn't hate Space. Space is terrible.
Just boring.
But yeah, there's nothing hateful in Space. It's just stupid. Whereas this was just, it was just not nice. And it should never have ever been made. It
should never have, like, the moment that somebody wrote down, like, okay, you get ghost rape, and everybody raises their eyebrows in the room, and it's like, you want to be very careful where you take this story. And, like, the moment the next bullet point hits with Asian orderly on it, you're like, okay, we're out.
Yeah, we're not doing this.
Yeah.
Jesus, yeah. So, yeah, good one. I absolutely agree. Number 1, then. What's your favourite episode?
This probably isn't going to be a surprise to you or to anybody, because I've actually had the luxury of talking about it on the podcast, and it's probably my second favourite episode of The X-Files ever, so it's One Breath.
Yes, that's mine as well.
Really? Wow.
Yeah.
Cool. It is just an astounding piece of television, and it's wonderfully emotionally affecting, and it's just like there are episodes of the X-Files that have stayed with me for multiple reasons. Like, there are episodes that I will remember because of images, or because of particular moments, or because of plot beats, or because of like decisions that were made, or because of just even cool monsters that are in them. But the thing about like One Breath is that One Breath actually emotionally affected me in a way that I don't think any other X-Files has, and in a way that I think very few episodes of television, or even very few pieces of media in general, have. Like, it's just a beautifully touching, it feels incredibly personal, and it, like, for all that, and again, we talked about this when we were talking about, like, Anasazi, and just in general, like, for all the X-Files is a show about, like, aliens and monsters and, like, conspiracies to take over the world, like, there's something incredibly relatable and understandable at the core of One Breath, to the point where, even if, like, you're not in hospital visiting somebody who was abducted by aliens and then dumped there with no record of a trace while government assassins are skulking through the building, like, you recognize the core aspect of feeling powerless while somebody you care about is in a position where they're sort of where they need help but you can't give it to them, and it's just One Breath captures that in a way that is so raw and so beautiful, and like I would honestly argue it's the best Mulder story in the 9 years of the show, and there are some phenomenal Mulder stories. Like, I mean, there's Paper Hearts, for example, but this I watch it, and even now, as a grown ass man who's seen it countless times and who knows all the story beats, I still get a little bit sniffly at it, and it's fantastic.
I can't put that better myself. It's wonderful. It's one of the few 10 out of 10s. And almost, if I could give it 11, I would. I mean, it's just fantastic. One Breath, and we talked in real depth about it in our podcast. I think it's possibly a testament to One Breath in that still remains our most downloaded episode of the Xcast by some distance.
I mean, it's one of the best conversations I've had about the show. Thank you very much, Tony.
That's very. I feel the same. It's very nice of you to say, but I think it's just one of those episodes I think strikes a chord with a lot of people. So, I think we're in agreement with a fair bit of this. Certainly the worst and best of Season 2.
Well, there's that yo-yo effect for you.
Yeah.
Some days you end up with One Breath, other days you end up with Excelsior Day. There's no way of knowing.
Yeah, and they're almost concurrent, actually. I think it's only like 2 or 3 episodes between them. And you're like, oh my God, how do we go from that to this? It's pretty something. So yeah, that's our second season coverage all done. That's it. We've done it. 25 episodes. We've now covered 49 episodes of the show completely. So as well as all the other things. So it's been a hell of a ride, and I can't wait. I've got to say, I can't wait to get cracking into season 3 because there are some treats to come there. And you'll be back, Darren, for a fair bit of this, yeah.
I hope so, if I'm lucky.
I think you will be. Don't worry. But yeah, until we do return for you once again being on the Xcast, thanks for coming on. And where can people find you?
You can find me at the movie blog, which is spelt with a 0 instead of an O. You can find me on Twitter at Darren_Mooney. I have published a book about the X-Files, which I am pimping like nobody's business. You can order it on Amazon. It's called Opening the X-Files, A Critical History of the Original Series. It's a great gift. It's coming out in November. So if you have any relatives who want an academic treatise of the X-Files as a cultural phenomenon, I would wholeheartedly recommend it. Also, if you want, you could also just order it through your local library as well, which would be very nice, and sort of get in and read it. It deals with a lot of the stuff that we sort of talked about here, so stuff about like Carter's themes, stuff like his handling of feminism, his handling of the Second World War, the theme of hyper-realism in the Seven Seas. It's got all this... It was great fun for me to write, and it was an excuse for me to rewatch the X-Files and sort of pick apart some of the themes and to talk about it in a bit of depth, and I really enjoyed writing it. And if you read it, I hope you really enjoy reading it.
I think I can't wait for that. That's on my Christmas list. Definitely, that book. I can't wait for it. So yeah, we will pimp that like nobody's business when it's out in November. Absolutely, cannot wait. You can find us as usual at the X_cast on Twitter, on Facebook with our page and our group, the X-Files Xcast podcast fan group, which has got plenty of members in there, loads of great chatter as we build up towards season 11. You can email us as well at the xfcast@gmail.com, and if you could like us on iTunes and leave us a review, even that'd be wonderful, like a few people have. But yeah, we're gonna be back. We've got some interesting stuff coming, and I'm not going to tell you what it is yet. But there are going to be some announcements coming about what we're doing in the run-up to Season 11, which I think you're all going to really, really like. It does mean that Season 3 is going to be a little bit later than I would have planned it to be. So Season 3 and The Blessing Way and beyond is probably not really going to hit until 2018 now, if I'm honest. But we've got some really cool stuff to keep you going beforehand. So I'll say no more on that matter. But keep your ears to the ground about the Xcast, because we're not going away, and we will have episodes dripping through the summer. Not as on a weekly schedule. We're not going to be quite that prolific for the next couple of months, but we do have some treats coming as we build up towards our 100th episode, actually, which we're very close to now. So yeah, we'll keep announcing, keep following the social media for more details.
Just to be clear on this, Tony is about to head to the bathroom. He's going to come back and tell us exactly what it is. Don't worry, I've checked and made sure the shower is clear.
Oh dear. Yeah.
Sorry.
Had to be done. Yeah, until we return anyway, in whatever guise that may be, just remember these immortal words. Forgive me.
He's not here! Where's Mulder? He's here. No, sir. If he was, he's vanished without a trace. Nothing vanishes without a trace. Burn it!